Hi there, and welcome to Know Where to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. We're going to be talking about the need to strike a balance when it comes to collective bargaining for public sector unions versus unions in the private sector. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there are a couple of bills that are being held up right now in the Idaho legislature, possibly at the behest of public sector unions, specifically teachers and firefighters. Interesting too, because these are professions which typically we revere. We honor our teachers as teaching the next generation. We honor the heroes who go out there as first responders. But when it comes to how the taxpayer is represented in that collective bargaining, well, that's a bit of an afterthought. I'll explain more in just a moment.
All reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy.
Once again, welcome to Know Where to Hide. Most of us, unless you are part of a public sector union, don't spend a lot of time thinking about them. But when it comes to public sector unions who are, bargaining for, better wages or working conditions or things like that, considering that those public sector employees are being paid by taxpayer funds, you would think the taxpayer would figure somewhere into that equation. And what this amounts to is these unions have a much stronger hold over government and over legislators than many people realize. And I'm going to draw upon the able minds of Fred Birnbaum from the Idaho Freedom Foundation, as well as Brian Allman from the Gem State Substack, to shed some light on this issue, and in particular, a couple of bills that you may or may not be aware of. So let's first of all take a look at Fred's article. This is published at the Idaho Freedom Foundation website, idahofreedom.org. Public sector union reform is needed in Idaho. And here Fred lays out some of the problems, but I love the context he provides here because he worked within the private sector. And he says, the private sector unions I negotiated with understood two things: that I was the representative of the company, and the shareholders, and that the union represented the workforce. Now, here's where that comes together. He says they understood that if the unions demanded too much in wages and benefits, the entire business could be put in jeopardy and they'd be out of a job. And he says, I understood that an engaged workforce needed to believe that they were compensated and treated fairly, and or quality or productivity would not meet the demands of the marketplace. Now, the flip side of that is in the public sector union negotiations, the union is often negotiating with elected officials who the union can support or oppose at the ballot box. So the point here is the taxpayer is not at the bargaining table and typically only feels the cost of a contract after the elected officials have moved on. Now, Fred says there are two government union reform bills before the legislature that appear to be stalled as he writes this: House Bill 98, HB 98, dealing with the teachers' unions, and House Bill 340, dealing with firefighters. So to break down what these are about, HB 98 prohibits public officials from using school district funds, personnel, or other resources to support teachers' unions. Now, he says, remember, the union is a private organization that collects dues from its members. So the bill would prohibit things like paying teachers taxpayer-paid wages to engage in union business as opposed to personal time off or union-paid time, or using resources to deduct dues for the unions or providing resources for union solicitation. Seems pretty straightforward. Brian Allman from the Gem State Chronicle and the Gem State Substack wrote about this, and he says, thankfully the influence with the teachers union, it's strong, but it wasn't strong enough to stop school choice in Idaho. But he says it's continuing to flex its muscles, particularly over HB 98, which would prohibit tax dollars from going to the teachers union in the form of paid time off for union activities, subsidizing those union dues, or even automatic deduction of dues from employee paychecks. So that passed the House 40-29, but currently is stalled in the Senate State Affairs Committee. Now, we talked last time. I'm going to just a quick aside here. We talked about this a couple of episodes ago. The chairman's drawer, where bills go to mysteriously disappear. It's the Bermuda Triangle of Idaho politics. Well, guess where some of these bills are sitting? Is they're being held in committee by chairman. And the question that Brian Allman asked is Senator Guthrie holding H98 in his drawer at the behest of the teachers union? Because he's clearly a union man, having taken the maximum $2,000 contribution from the Teamsters in 2024 out of more than $44,000 donated by corporations, associations, and trade unions. So it's not as if he needed the help that year. He was unopposed in the Republican primary. He defeated his Democratic opponent with 78.5% of the vote last November. Nevertheless, securing an alliance with the powerful chairman of Senate State Affairs, that's a small price to pay for a campaign donation. And the Political Action Committee for Education, or PACE, the teachers union PAC, gave Guthrie $500 in 2022. That's a bargain for keeping H98 in his drawer this year. See how this works? Influence. So the committee, under the leadership of its chair, has been, Jim Guthrie, has been a roadblock to good legislation for a long time. Remember, Guthrie was the only Republican to vote against House Bill 32 prohibiting mask mandates. He often finds himself at odds with the majority of Republican legislators. However, as a committee chair, he has nearly unlimited power over whether a bill is placed on the agenda. So that's it for the teachers union bill. But what about the firefighters bill? Okay, going back to Fred Birnbaum's article, HB 340 would restrict firefighters unions to bargaining only over wages, because currently Idaho law allows those firefighters the right to bargain over virtually everything, including all terms and conditions of employment. In other words, the union essentially takes over the management duties. Now, a key feature of private sector union contracts is a management rights clause, which essentially says that what's not covered by the agreement is reserved to management. Otherwise, how can managers manage if everything is always subject to union demands, from staffing to overtime or even what equipment can be used? That's a good point. So I wanted you to see this because the visual on this is very powerful. House Bill 340, itself awaiting a hearing in House Commerce and Human Resources, would restrict unions' bargaining ability solely to wages rather than allowing them to negotiate over virtually everything, as is currently the case. So this is Brian Allman's write-up in the Gem State Substack. But he says, when Representative Rob Beiswinger introduced this bill in the House State Affairs last month, several members of the firefighters union sat in the audience watching with disapproval. Look at those faces and tell me that you see anything other than disapproval there. Now, we've seen law enforcement do this too, officers showing up in uniform and sternly looking on from the gallery and stuff. And I assume, it's the same kind of psychological effect. Who are you to deny these heroes or to otherwise interfere with the carrying out of their duties? But kind of a powerful visual there when you see those disapproving faces, looking on. I mean, these are heroes. Now, Fred points out, interestingly enough, neither one of these bills impedes the right of teachers and firefighters to organize, yet the opposition from both the teachers and the firefighters to HB 98, that's the teachers union bill, during the hearing was fierce. Did you catch that? The firefighters testified against the teachers union reform bill, even though it had nothing to do with their union. HB 98 now sits in the Senate State Affairs, having passed the House with a solid margin a month ago. And the bill limiting firefighters to bargaining for pay and wages never even got a hearing. It was just introduced, and that's it. So let's talk about a couple quick things as to why does this matter? And I love that Fred actually he pulled up something from President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was very liberal, very pro-organized labor, but who also understood that public sector unions were inherently problematic and essentially organized against the taxpayer. So in a 1937 letter to the National Federation of Federal Employees, FDR said, all government employees should realize that the process of collective bargaining, as usually understood, cannot be transplanted into the public service. It has its distinct and insurmountable limitations when applied to public personnel management. The very nature and purposes of government make it impossible for administrative officials to represent fully or to bind the employer in mutual discussions with government employee organizations. The employer is the whole people who speak by means of laws enacted by their representatives in Congress. And again, it just raises that question: who's representing the people? This is why this matters. And a final thought here from Brian Allman from the Gem State Substack. He says one of the reasons that the public sector unions, like those representing teachers and firefighters, hold so much sway in our society is that the people they represent are rightly held in high regard by most Idahoans. We love our teachers and our firefighters, don't we? Teachers spend their days educating the next generation. Firefighters put their lives on the line to save us during the worst disasters. Yet does it necessarily follow that their unions should wield so much control? His recommendation, I think this is actually a very good call to action, is if you want to see some of that power reined in and balance restored for Idaho taxpayers, well, then contact Senator Guthrie and House Commerce and HR Chair Representative James Holzclaw and respectfully ask them to hear H98 and H340 respectively. I'm guessing this is an issue that probably wasn't on a ton of people's radar screen, but now that it's on your radar screen, perhaps you'll be a little bit more aware. I don't know. A lot of people that when they hear terms like collective bargaining, their eyes kind of glaze over and they have a really hard time, focusing from that point on. But you can see why this matters. Look, in private sector, collective bargaining, great. They understand there's a balance that has to be struck. But when the taxpayer is the one who's providing the funding, that accountability sometimes becomes just a little bit fuzzy, and it really shouldn't. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
All reporters are biased. The Idaho Press Club are biased. All media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy.